Joseph Smith is dead, propped up outside the Carthage jail next to the well. Hiram Smith is dead, upstairs in the sitting room. Almost immediately after the mob killed Joseph, they began to shout, quote, "The Mormons are coming, the Mormons are coming," end quote. For some reason, this group of men were certain that the Nauvoo Legion had marched on the town and were going to instantly avenge the death of their prophet, and so the mob scatters into the woods from where they came. Willard Richards goes and finds John Taylor hidden underneath the bed. He drags John past the dead body of Hiram and into the adjacent room upstairs where the jail cell is. He hides John's body inside the cell underneath a mattress in case the mob comes back to kill the rest of them. Willard Richards is preparing himself for a second wave of attacks. I'm Stephen Detloff, and this is the Strangers and Pilgrims podcast, telling the story of the death of the prophet Joseph Smith. Willard, standing at the head of the stairs, is bracing himself for a second round of attacks from the mob. After a space of time, he realizes that the mob has left, that they're all gone. So he goes back into the jail cell where he has hidden John Taylor, and he drags John out from underneath the mattresses and out of the cell and lays him at the head of the stairs, directly in front of the door to the room where Hiram's dead body lay. John will lay there in the hallway for the next 9 hours without having his wounds dressed, laying there, sometimes staring through the open door at the dead body of Hiram. Of this time, John Taylor said, quote, "There Hiram lay as I had left him. He had not moved a limb. He laid placid and calm, a monument of greatness even in death. But his noble spirit had left his tenement, and was gone to dwell in regions more congenial to its exalted nature." End quote. Soon doctors and coroners came to the scene. They insist that John be taken to the Hamilton Hotel to have his wounds taken care of. And John responds hesitantly and probably angrily, quote, "I don't know you. Who am I among you? I am surrounded by assassins and murderers. Don't talk to me of kindness or comfort. Look at your murdered victims. Look at me. I want none of your counsel or comfort." End quote. Now, before their death, Joseph and Hiram's younger brother, Samuel, had heard his brothers were in jail and had left on his horse to Carthage to visit them. Samuel lived 40 miles south of Nauvoo in a city called Plymouth. He was one of the Latter-day Saints. He was one of the Latter-day Saint refugees who built up other settlements in Illinois instead of in Nauvoo. When on the way to Carthage, Samuel met a group of the mob who had just left from Joseph's assassination. And after they're relating the story to Samuel, they find out that he is the younger brother of the two dead men. And so they try to kill Samuel too. Samuel on horseback runs off into the woods and is chased for 2 hours before he finally makes it to Carthage. When Samuel gets to Carthage, he helps Willard Richards move the bodies of the two dead brothers into the Hamilton Hotel, while John Taylor stays on the top floor of the jail. And while all this is happening, it's nighttime. Joseph was killed a little after 5 in the evening, and John Taylor lay at the top of the stairs until 2 in the morning. And meanwhile, back in Nauvoo, Porter Rockwell can't sleep. He gets on his horse and rides out to Carthage to check on his friend Joseph. And on the road there, 2 men stop him. They've just left Carthage and are carrying the news back that Joseph and Hiram are dead. And Porter immediately turns around and rides back into Nauvoo. He rides through the streets in the middle of the night, shouting, quote, "Joseph is dead. They have killed him. They have killed him." End quote. And just then, one of these men that met Porter on the road to Carthage knocked on the door to Emma and Joseph's house. He told Emma that Joseph had been killed. Emma broke down. Her wailing is so loud that it wakes up her sleeping children. And as they wake up and go to see what's wrong with their mother, she tells them their father has died, and they start to cry too. Another man goes to tell Hiram's wife, Mary Fielding Smith, that her husband has died. Mary asked, quote, "It cannot be possible, can it?" End quote. Mary's daughter later recounted that, quote, "The news flew like wildfire through the house. The crying and agony, the anguish and sorrow that were felt can be easier felt than described." End quote. By the time the news of Joseph and Hiram's death hit Nauvoo, Governor Ford had already left the city. And when he heard the news, he rode to Carthage, warning everyone there to leave, warning them that the Latter-day Saints would come and destroy the city in a quick act of vengeance. Governor Ford then rides off to Quincy, Illinois, about 40 miles south of Carthage, to set up a temporary headquarters and oversee the war that will follow. However, there would be no war or retaliation after the death of Joseph Smith. The Nauvoo Legion would not march out against the mob. The entire city mourned the loss of their 2 leaders and did not actively seek out retribution. And later on in the morning, as John Taylor's wife was coming to Carthage to try and take care of her husband, who had since been moved to the Hamilton Hotel, the bodies of Joseph and Hiram were on a wagon and going back to Nauvoo. The owner of the Hamilton Hotel had put Joseph and Hiram in pine caskets, covered with branches to shield them from the sun and prevent the bodies from warming up and stinking. Mr. Hamilton drove one wagon with Joseph's body, and Samuel drove the other wagon with his brother Hiram's body. Willard Richards was also with the two men. In Nauvoo, about 8,000 people had lined the streets to watch the procession bring in the dead leaders. And after driving his brother's coffin back to Nauvoo, Samuel told his mother Lucy, quote, "Mother, I have a dreadful distress in my side ever since I was chased by the mob, and I think I have received some injury which is going to make me sick." End quote. A few weeks later, this illness would kill him, and Joseph Smith's mother Lucy would have 3 of her sons die in the short span of a month. After Joseph and Hiram's bodies were cleaned and dressed and placed inside the Nauvoo mansion, the families went in to see them. And Joseph and Hiram's mother, writing about the moment, said, quote, "I had for a long time braced every nerve, roused every energy of my soul, and called upon God to strengthen me. But when I entered the room and saw my murdered sons extended both at once before my eyes, and heard the sobs and groans of my family, and the cries of father, husband, brothers, from the lips of their wives, children, brothers, and sisters, it was too much. I sank back, crying to the Lord in agony of my soul, my God, why hast thou forsaken this family?" End quote. And Lucy Smith, after telling of how she sank back, said she heard a voice reply, quote, "I have taken them to myself that they might have rest." End quote. The next morning, Saturday, the bodies are placed in coffins with glass lids covering their faces. The 10,000 mourners filed through the house that day to pay respect to the fallen brothers. At the time, there was still a bounty on the head of Joseph Smith in Missouri, and this made Emma scared that a grave robber might dig up her husband's body, cut off his head, and bring it back across the river to Missouri to collect the bounty. As a result, after the viewings are over, the bodies are removed from the coffins, and the coffins are filled with sand. The empty coffins are taken and buried in the cemetery, and the real bodies are buried in the unfinished basement of Joseph's house. That night it rained, and the rain seeped into the basement and covered the signs of burial so that no one could tell the two men were actually hidden there. A week after the burial, Sidney Rigdon learns of Joseph's death. And I briefly mentioned in episode 2 that Sidney Rigdon is one of the 3 men in the highest governing body of the church, which group was called the First Presidency. Well, with William Law gone and Joseph Smith gone, the only living member of the church's highest governing body is now Sidney Rigdon. And when Sidney Rigdon joined the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints 14 years earlier, he was a preacher in the Campbellite religion. When he converted and was baptized into the Restored Church of Jesus Christ, after hearing of the church's doctrines from one of the members of his own congregation, Sidney brought along most of the rest of his congregation with him into the church. So not only was Sidney a member of the church's First Presidency, but he shepherded in a lot of the early Latter-day Saint converts to the church. And not only that, but Sidney was also the vice president on Joseph Smith's ticket for the president of the United States. And so even though he hasn't played a large part in our story, at the time, Sidney Rigdon was an extremely well-known leader within the church and was probably at the forefront of a lot of Latter-day Saint minds now that Joseph has died. Now, Sidney learned of Joseph's death from a newspaper that he read in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Sidney was in Pittsburgh because a month earlier he had been called to go there by Joseph. He left for Pittsburgh with his family, actually 4 days after the Nauvoo Expositor Press had been destroyed, and arrived in Pittsburgh the day of Joseph's murder. About the same time that Sidney learned of Joseph's death, Brigham Young in Salem, Massachusetts, sent a letter back west to Willard Richards. He's still trying to get Joseph elected as president, and was sending in an update. In the letter, he said, quote, "The prevailing opinion is that Joseph Smith is the smartest man in the Union, and the people are afraid of his smartness. Some will vote for him for the novelty of the thing, and some to see what a prophet will do at the head of government. You might ask what we think about Brother Joseph getting the election this year. You know all about it. We shall do all we can and leave the event with God. The God of heaven will do just as he pleases about it." End quote. And Brigham would learn of Joseph's death a week after he sends this letter. Now, Brigham Young is the president of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And the Quorum of the 12 Apostles, again, is the second highest governing body of the church. and Brigham Young was its president. So Brigham Young and the 12 apostles start to travel back west to Nauvoo. But by the time they're starting to head back west, Sidney has already reached out to Brigham. Sidney wants Brigham to come through Pittsburgh on his way back to Nauvoo so they can all meet together. Sidney and 10 of the 12 apostles. Sidney has started to tell people in Pittsburgh that it was his time to, quote, take his place at the head of the church in spite of men or devils at the risk of his life, end quote. Sidney starts to tell people that he has had a revelation in which God has told him that he would be the new head of the church. So Sidney wants to get Brigham and the other apostles on board with his plan there in Pittsburgh. He wants them to approve of Sidney taking over leadership of the church before they even get back to Nauvoo. But Brigham Young tells Sidney no. Brigham tells Sidney they're not going to go through Pittsburgh and visit him. They're going to go around the long way back to Nauvoo, as they believe it will be safer, through Buffalo, New York, and into Chicago, Illinois, and then down to Nauvoo. And Brigham and everyone else really doesn't want to decide the new leadership of the church as quickly as Sidney does. Sidney wants to get elected the new president and get it over with. Brigham wants to wait. Get back to Nauvoo and see what's going on. So about a month after Sidney and Brigham both learn of Joseph's death, the two men are back in Nauvoo to settle the question of the church's leadership. The church's leader, prophet, and founder is dead. The prophet's brother, Hiram, is dead. Joseph and Hiram's other brother, Samuel, has been dead for a week now as a result of that injury sustained during his fleeing from the mob on the way to Carthage. And Joseph's last brother, William, is in New York City. He's still publishing that political newspaper we talked about called The Prophet. Sidney gets back to Nauvoo and starts going around telling people that he should be the man to lead the church, but not as a prophet, as a guardian instead. Sidney tells people that Joseph is irreplaceable, that no one can do what he did, and that Joseph will always be the prophet of the church, and so the only thing to do is to place himself, Sidney, as a guardian. He tells the people that he has had a revelation, that God has spoken to him, and that he should be the church's guardian. He tells the people that he came to Nauvoo to see if they would accept him as their leader, but if not, there were tens of thousands of other people out there who were ready for him to step up and lead them, other Latter-day Saints who were all across America. Sidney is pushing hard this timeline that he has to leave Nauvoo to go see his other followers and get back to his family in Pittsburgh, and so he must have this guardianship voted on by the people before he leaves in a few days. Now, Sidney Rigdon isn't the only person claiming to be the new leader of the religion. There are over 15 people claiming to be the new leader after Joseph's death, or if not claiming to be the new leader, at least trying to let their views be heard and followed. One of these people is a man named James Strang. He's claiming that Joseph Smith had written him a letter 2 weeks before he died, telling him that he was to be the new leader of the restored Church of Jesus Christ and take the people to settle in Wisconsin. Lyman White is also starting to establish his independence now that Joseph is dead. Lyman is a member of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. Back in Missouri, Lyman had been in Liberty Jail, along with Joseph and Hiram and Sidney Rigdon. He was one of the leaders of the group of men charged with treason in Missouri for attempting to fight against the militia that had appeared to massacre them in Far West. And Lyman is more reminding people really. Lyman is reminding people that Joseph Smith had told him to settle in Texas before he died, and that Joseph told him that settling Texas would be his lifelong mission. And Joseph had already sent Lyman on one trip to Texas to scout out places to colonize. Now, Lyman didn't claim that he was a new prophet of the church, and he didn't claim that he was going to be the leader. He simply claimed that Joseph had told him to do something and that he was going to do it, and that anyone who would take over as a leader of the Latter-day Saints, now that Joseph was gone, did not have the authority to change Joseph's original directives to him. Now, these men and others are getting some traction with a few of the Latter-day Saints here and there, but they're not getting a lot of traction with the church as a whole. Now, one of these 15 people claiming to be the new leader of this religion is not William Law. Now, you'll remember William already has a church, and he's been claiming to be a new prophet for the last few months. But everyone knows now that William and his associates are Joseph's enemies, even though in their newspaper and elsewhere they've repeatedly claimed allegiance to Joseph's earlier religious teachings. William's associates were in the meeting with Governor Ford, telling him that the Latter-day Saint affidavits were lies, and they were in the group of men that stormed Carthage jail that killed Prophet Joseph. Anyway, a month and a half after Joseph had died, Brigham Young, most of the 12 apostles, and Sidney Rigdon have made it back to Nauvoo. And Sidney calls a meeting on Thursday, August 8th. And about 5,000 people showed up to the meeting. It's outside, and Sidney calls the meeting, quote, a prayer meeting, and interchange of thought and feelings to warm up each other's hearts, end quote. And even though he says that the meeting isn't about choosing Joseph's successor, that it's more of a time to get together and comfort one another, as he speaks, Sidney starts to talk about how he should be Joseph's successor. And he tells people about the vision he had in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and he reminds everyone that while Joseph was alive, he, Sidney, was a spokesperson for him. Sidney tells everyone, quote, no man can be successor of Joseph. The martyred prophet is still the head of this church. I propose to be a guardian to the people, end quote. And in fact, Sidney starts to push himself and really sell himself as the new leader of the church, to the point that he's about to ask for a vote that people will have him as their leader, when suddenly Brigham Young stands up and takes over control of the meeting from Sidney. He tells everyone that there will be no vote and that the meeting will be over, but there will be a new meeting later that afternoon. Well, at this new meeting in the afternoon, Brigham Young speaks. He talks about the difference between the quorum of the 12 apostles leading the church and Sidney Rigdon leading the church. He says, quote, do you want a spokesman? If Sidney Rigdon wants to be a spokesman to the prophet, he must go to the other side of the veil, for the prophet is there, but Elder Rigdon is here, end quote. Brigham Young tells the people there that the quorum of the 12 apostles will lead the church in the same way that Joseph did, with keys and authority and revelations. And Brigham and other members of the quorum of the 12 apostles stand up and speak. And other leaders of the church stand up and speak too. And they start picking sides. Do they support Sidney or Brigham? And Sidney expects some of these men to stand up and support him, to stand up and say, I'm with Sidney, let's have him as a guardian of the church. But each leader stands up and supports Brigham Young. They support the idea that the quorum of the 12 apostles should lead the church now that Joseph is dead. And as each speaker gets up and supports Brigham Young's views of the church's leadership, Sidney is getting anxious. He's getting worried. He can feel the audience start to turn. They showed up for Sidney's meeting earlier in the morning, and now they are all agreeing with Brigham Young at his meeting. Brigham then asks for another vote. He asks if they want Sidney Rigdon to be church guardian, or if they want the 12 apostles to lead the church. Now, of the 5,000 people in attendance, it's unanimous that they want the quorum of the 12 apostles. After the vote, Brigham Young tries to get Sidney Rigdon on board with him and the other leaders. He tells everyone that they want Sidney with them, that they need him with the church. Well, as soon as Sidney saw that the church was not following him, but was following Brigham Young, instead, he's out. He's been in the first presidency of the church for 14 years. He received and experienced numerous revelations with Joseph. He has had great visions. He was in the governing body that was above the quorum of the 12 apostles. So Sidney, instead of joining up with Brigham Young, goes around now claiming that the church is not led by men of God anymore. Not only that, but that it had not been led by God for a long time, for 3 to 4 years in fact. Sidney starts to go around teaching that the restored church of Jesus Christ had not been led by men inspired of God for 3 to 4 years, and that Joseph was a fallen prophet. He tells everyone that he, Sidney, had been called by God to fix the church's incorrect course. And then, just as William Law had done a few months earlier, Sidney starts his own church. 4 days after the church rejected his leadership for the leadership of Brigham Young and the quorum of the 12 apostles, Sidney started gathering together a group of followers and started his own religion. And so, since he's going around starting his own religion, just like William Law, and going around saying Joseph was a fallen prophet, he's excommunicated from the church. And he and some of his followers return to his family in Pittsburgh, where he begins to publish a newspaper in which he attacks the church and the 12 apostles' claims to be its leaders, all the while claiming that Joseph Smith was a fallen transgressor, again, just like William Law had done. Now, at its largest, Sidney Rigdon's Reformation religion never reached more than 400 members. He was visited by missionaries, however, of one of the more successful Reformation movements led by James Strang. Strang's argument that Joseph had written him a letter that he was to lead the church to Michigan was compelling to a lot of Latter-day Saints. James Strang attracted 2,000 members of Joseph's religion, which would have been a little less than 10% of the total religion at the time. As Strang was ordained a king by his followers and set up an island kingdom in the American Midwest on one of the Great Lakes. And 6 years later, like Joseph Smith, James Strang was also assassinated. After Strang's assassination, most of the members of his church would leave and join a church that was led by Joseph Smith's son, Joseph Smith III. The name of this organization was the Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, in contrast to Brigham Young's church, which retained the name of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. The Reorganized Church wouldn't really organize itself until 14 years after the death of Joseph Smith, when it kind of collected and gathered up a lot of the other churches that had been created with Joseph's death. The church led by Joseph Smith's son is now called the Community of Christ. A Lyman White's group of Latter-day Saints ended up moving down to Texas near San Antonio. They set up a few colonies, all of which are now buried underneath a man-made lake. And after Lyman White died, his followers left too. Some went to join Joseph Smith III's church, and others went out west to present-day Utah and joined up with the Restored Church of Jesus Christ led by Brigham Young. And that is who most of the Latter-day Saints supported as their leader. The main body of Latter-day Saints, or the largest majority of them, followed Brigham Young and the other leaders of the Quorum of the 12 Apostles and remained in Nauvoo. And now that Joseph Smith is dead, the mob is waiting. They're waiting for the church in Nauvoo to collapse and for the city to empty as disinterested Latter-day Saints go back to their old homes and places where they were living. They believed that Joseph Smith was the entirety of this new religion, and that as soon as he died, the organization would quickly disappear. But the church didn't collapse. Now, yes, it did have competing factions and leaders, and some of these splinter groups left. Lyman White went to Texas with his followers. Strang went to Wisconsin with his, Sidney Rigdon back to Pittsburgh. But again, the majority of the Latter-day Saints and the converts from England that kept pouring in remained in Nauvoo under the leadership of Brigham Young and the Quorum of the 12 Apostles. And Brigham Young and the Apostles, as leaders of the church, didn't stop. They kept sending out missionaries, kept bringing in converts, and kept bringing in immigrants from Great Britain. They kept building the partially completed Nauvoo Temple, too. Brigham Young told the Latter-day Saints to, quote, stay here, plow, sow, and build, end quote, and that, quote, one plowshare will do more to drive off the mob than 2 guns, end quote. Well, after a few months, the locals, like Thomas Sharp, realized that the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints as a whole weren't leaving, and they were still practicing their religion, and they were still a powerful voting bloc, and they were still probably planning to kill everyone in Hancock County and establish a Latter-day Saint caliphate. And so the mob starts up their persecutions again. 3 months after the death of the prophet Joseph, the mob started advertising in the local papers that they were going to start attacking the Latter-day Saints. And so 3 months after the death of Joseph Smith, Governor Ford comes back to Carthage to prevent a civil war again. This time, however, Governor Ford comes with a militia of 500 men to arrest the leaders of the mob. Governor Ford's no longer just coming to collect affidavits and hear stories. And with the arrival of Governor Ford and his militia, most of the leaders of this new mob escape into Missouri and elude the governor. And in January of 1845, 7 months after the death of Joseph, one of the goals of William Law and the anti-Mormon party is finally realized. The Nauvoo City Charter is finally repealed by Illinois Senate and the House of Representatives. Nauvoo's police force is dismantled, and so the citizens of Nauvoo are forced to police themselves. So the church organizes its own police force through its existing congregations. 3 months after that, in March of 1845, the trial against 9 of the men charged in Joseph Smith's death is over. And one of the men on trial was Thomas Sharp, leader of the anti-Mormon party. And of the hundreds of men involved in Joseph's death, these 9 men who went to trial were all found not guilty and acquitted of all charges. And the trial regarding men charged with the death of Hiram Smith never happened. The state prosecutors never showed up. No one was interested in pursuing the case anyways, because the county was once again a powder keg and everyone was just trying to keep the peace. Everyone felt that if Hiram's murderers were charged in his death, the mob would lash out and start killing again. By this time, September of 1845 came around, mobs began to attack Latter-day Saint settlements that were outside of Nauvoo City, just like they had done right before Joseph Smith declared martial law. Over 100 buildings and homes were burned down by arsons, and one of the Latter-day Saint homeowners, a man named Durfee, ran out into the night to put out a fire on his property and was shot by the mob. His wife and children were then marched outside and given an order to leave. Brigham Young sent out rescue teams to bring refugees into Nauvoo. He prepared the city and army to survive a siege from the mobs. This time, however, the government began fighting the mobs. The sheriff of Hancock County led his posse to attack men burning settlements. They killed a couple and wounded others. And all these events eventually rolled together until a small war broke out. It was quickly ended when the sheriff rode an army of a few hundred Latter-day Saints into Carthage and chased the leaders of the mob into Missouri again. Well, later in the month, the mob gathered together in Illinois and decided that the only people that could prevent bloodshed were the Latter-day Saints, and that the only way the Latter-day Saints could prevent bloodshed was by leaving Nauvoo. The Latter-day Saints, the victims of mob persecution, were the only people that could placate the will of the people, and that was by leaving. So Brigham Young wrote a letter to the people of Hancock County. He said the Latter-day Saints would leave, that they just needed time to get everything together. They asked that their attackers would please buy up their land and property or trade them for goods, food, clothing, oxen, anything that they would need to take their trek west. And Brigham Young promised the mob that they would be gone in the spring of the following year, the spring of 1846, but it didn't take that long. By the end of February 1846, most of the Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo had left. Brigham Young himself and most of the leaders of the church left in February. By the end of May, over 12,000 Latter-day Saints had fled Nauvoo, across the Mississippi River into Iowa. And all the houses in Nauvoo had turned into workshops for building wagons. Over 1,000 wagons carried people out of the city. Eventually, there were more wagons than there were oxen to pull them. Latter-day Saints in Nauvoo were traveling hundreds of miles to find oxen to buy, to pull their wagons, to head west as refugees. Refugee camps had been set up all across Iowa as the Latter-day Saints started their journey west. One of the people who remained in Nauvoo was Daniel H. Wells, the non-Latter-day Saint Justice of the Peace. Daniel H. Wells, you might remember, was the judge who oversaw Joseph's second trial regarding the city's destruction of the Nauvoo expositor that we talked about in episode 4. And in episode 6, we talked about how Daniel Wells, who everyone called Squire Wells, was the last person that Joseph stopped to visit on his way to Carthage jail before being turned around to go back to Nauvoo and oversee the Nauvoo Legion turning in their weapons. Well, Wells, left behind in Nauvoo, saw all this persecution his neighbors were enduring once again and felt that the Latter-day Saints were just misunderstood. He saw the murder of the prophet, the increased persecutions after his death, the Civil War, kind of like Dan Jones, reading all Thomas Sharp's anti-Mormon party newspaper and becoming convinced that the Latter-day Saint enemies were wrong. Daniel Wells saw all this persecution that was raging on against the Latter-day Saints. And almost 2 years after its prophet's death, and that August, Daniel Wells is baptized into the restored Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And before his baptism, Daniel had a long history with the church. He'd settled in Nauvoo 5 years before the Latter-day Saints arrived. He actually owned 80 acres, of which he broke into lots and sold all the lots to Latter-day Saints when they arrived from Missouri. And some of that 80 acres was land on which the Nauvoo Temple was built. Well, a month after his baptism, there's another battle in Nauvoo. Daniel H. Wells, left behind, led the militia. A battle of 1,000 citizens of Nauvoo versus a mob of 800. And after Daniel Wells led the Latter-day Saints in a battle and defeated the 800 men, they decided it was best to, instead of keep fighting, to flee. Wells told the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints left behind in Nauvoo, the ones who had not yet escaped out of Nauvoo, quote, "I have been in the councils of Joseph and Hiram and the 12. I know they were desirous that the saints should leave the states and go westward." End quote. He continued, quote, "Brethren, reflect. We have nothing to gain in defending Nauvoo, but everything to lose. But life also is hourly in peril." End quote. And many of the men and women remaining in Nauvoo then left. They crossed the Mississippi River into Iowa. And as they left the city, the mob came in and took over the temple, the Nauvoo Temple, the building they'd been working on for years, the one temple they were finally going to get to keep. It wasn't even finished. It had been in use as an unfinished building for about 3 months. The mob came in, took over the temple. They used it as their base of operations. They put a cannon up on the roof, where they would shoot cannonballs across the Mississippi River into refugee camps in Iowa. And Daniel Wells actually collected one of the cannonballs and sent it to the governor of Iowa, attempting to convince him that Missouri was violating his territory through war. And Daniel Wells, when he escaped across the Mississippi River into Iowa, with other refugees, left behind a wife and child in Nauvoo. Neither of them had been converted and baptized in the church along with him. And for 2 years, living in Iowa, Daniel tried to get his family to come with him to Utah, to join Brigham Young and the Latter-day Saints, but they refused. So Daniel, as a religious convert, would travel to Utah by himself. He would later get remarried, and he eventually became the third mayor of Salt Lake City, and he also becomes one of the 3 members of the church's first presidency. Another family that's left behind in Nauvoo is Joseph Smith's family. Hiram Smith's family leaves Nauvoo as refugees. They follow Brigham Young and his main branch of the church. And one of the wagons that left Nauvoo was driven by Hiram Smith's son, Joseph F. Smith, who 2 years after his father's death was then only 7 years old. Joseph F. Smith and his widowed mother would stay in Nebraska for a year and a half before crossing the plains west as they saved up money for an oxen team. But the widow Emma Smith and her children stay in Nauvoo. Brigham and other leaders of the church try to persuade Emma to go west with them, but she refuses. She also ignored all the other men who had led religious factions out of the state after Joseph died. During the last battle of Nauvoo in September, Emma moved her family out of the city. A year and a half later, in December of 1847, Emma remarried to a man named Louis Bideman. And 5 months before her marriage, on July 24, 1847, the first pioneers, led by Brigham Young, reached the valley of present-day Salt Lake City, Utah. The story of these Latter-day Saint pioneers crossing the plains and the Rocky Mountains into the Salt Lake City Valley is another story of great struggle and heartache and faith. And one of the most recent prophets of the church said the church's history is, quote, one of being driven, of being winnowed and peeled, or being persecuted and hounded, end quote. He then quoted the words of the Apostle Paul in his second epistle to the Corinthians. Quote, "We are troubled on every side, yet not distressed. We are perplexed, but not in despair. Persecuted, but not forsaken. Cast down, but not destroyed." End quote. The next episode of the podcast will be our last in Season 1 of the Strangers and Pilgrims podcast. 23 years after the death of his father, Hiram, and the death of his uncle, Joseph, Joseph F. Smith travels back east from Utah to visit the sites surrounding his father and uncle's murder and the sites of the church's persecutions. Scripts of each podcast episode can be found at our website, www.pilgrimspodcast.com. Music for this episode is from the song Carthage Waltz. It was written and recorded by Michael Hinckley, and the dialogue was written and recorded by myself, Stephen Detloff.